My name is Jane Ben, and for 23 years, I believed love meant swallowing fire. The first time Danny Richards destroyed one of my business meetings, I told myself it was rock and roll. The second time he showed up drunk to our anniversary dinner, I called it passion. By the 100th time he sabotaged something I'd built with my own hands, I had run out of excuses, but not out of hope. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there from the beginning, scattered like broken glass across our marble floors. But when you're 25 and married to a god of rock, when his voice can fill stadiums and his presence can bend the will of executives twice his age, you convince yourself that chaos is just the price of genius. Danny Richards wasn't just any rock star. He was the rock star of our generation. 3 decades of platinum albums, sold-out world tours, and enough controversy to fuel 1,000 tabloid headlines. When we met in 1987, I was working as a talent scout for Meridian Records, hunting for the next big thing in dingy clubs across Los Angeles. He was already a legend, but legends, I learned, need handlers. What started as professional consultation became personal obsession. He needed someone to manage his image, his contracts, his life. I needed someone to prove that my instincts about talent were as sharp as everyone claimed. We were a perfect storm of ambition and dysfunction. For the first decade, it worked. I transformed his career from a series of spectacular highs and devastating lows into a steady empire of success. I negotiated his contracts, managed his tours, crafted his public image, and built the infrastructure that would support not just his career, but the careers of dozens of other artists who orbited around our management company, Zenith Entertainment. Danny liked to tell interviewers that I was his secret weapon. He'd lean back in leather chairs, that trademark smirk playing across his lips, and explain how his wife was the brains behind his brawn. The magazines ate it up. The power couple of rock, they called us. Beauty and the Beast of the music industry. I should have paid attention to which one they thought was the beast. The first crack in our foundation appeared in 1995. I had spent months courting a young British band called Crimson Tide, convinced they were the next big thing. Their sound was raw, honest, dangerous in all the right ways. I flew to London 6 times, sat through endless meetings with their difficult manager, and finally convinced them to sign with Zenith Entertainment. The night we celebrated the deal, Danny disappeared for 3 days. When he finally stumbled home, reeking of whiskey and cheap perfume, he found me in our home office, reviewing the contracts one final time. "You're wasting your time," he slurred, swaying against the doorframe. I didn't look up from the papers. "These contracts are going to make us a fortune, Danny. Crimson Tide is exactly what the industry needs right now." He laughed, a bitter sound that made my skin crawl. "Crimson Tide won't be signing with anyone." That's when I noticed the satisfied gleam in his bloodshot eyes. That's when the cold realization hit me like a slap. "What did you do?" "Made a few phone calls. Told the right people the right stories." Amazing how quickly a band's reputation can crumble when certain rumors start circulating. I finally looked up, the contracts forgotten. "You sabotaged my deal." "Our deal," he corrected, stumbling further into the room. "Everything you do reflects on me, Jane. And I won't have my name associated with second-rate British noise." That was the first time I understood that Danny didn't see me as his partner. He saw me as his property. And property, apparently, wasn't allowed to make decisions without permission. Crimson Tide never recovered from whatever poison Danny had spread through the industry grapevine. Their label dropped them within a month, citing creative differences and image concerns. They disbanded 6 months later, for brilliant musicians crushed by rumors I never got to hear but could easily imagine. I should have left him then. Should have packed my things, liquidated my half of our assets, and started over somewhere far from his toxic influence. Instead, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. A moment of weakness brought on by too much alcohol and too much ego. I convinced myself that the man I married was still somewhere inside the monster who had destroyed my deal. I was wrong. The monster was the man I married. I had just been too blind to see it. The sabotage became a pattern, subtle at first, then increasingly brazen. In 1997, I discovered an incredible singer-songwriter named Rebecca Torres. She had the kind of voice that could make grown men weep and the kind of stage presence that commanded attention without demanding it. I spent 4 months developing her sound, helping her craft an album that would have redefined what pop music could be. 2 weeks before we were scheduled to pitch her to major labels, Rebecca called me, crying. "Someone's been spreading stories about me," she whispered into the phone. "Saying I'm unreliable. That I have a drug problem. That I sleep with producers for deals." None of it was true. Rebecca was one of the most professional artists I'd ever worked with. Clean as a whistle and twice as focused. But in the music industry, perception is reality, and perception can be purchased with the right connections and the right whispered words in the right ears. I traced the rumors back to their source within a week. The stories had originated from 3 different industry insiders, all of them people Danny golfed with, drank with, or owed favors to. When I confronted him, he didn't even bother to deny it. "She wasn't right for our roster," he said, not looking up from his morning newspaper. "She was exactly right for our roster. She could have been the biggest artist we'd ever signed. Bigger than me." He finally looked up, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that made my stomach turn. That's when I realized what was happening. Danny wasn't just sabotaging my deals randomly. He was systematically destroying any artist who might overshadow him, any deal that might give me too much power, any success that might prove I didn't need him to thrive in this industry. Rebecca Torres disappeared from the music scene entirely. Last I heard, she was teaching piano lessons to children in Iowa, her dreams suffocated by lies she never had the resources to fight. The pattern continued for years. Every major deal I brought to the table, every promising artist I tried to develop, every expansion of our business that didn't center entirely around Danny Richards and his aging rock god persona, all of it met mysterious obstacles, sudden complications, or complete collapse. Victor Kendall, a jazz fusion guitarist with revolutionary techniques, found himself blacklisted after stories surfaced about his supposedly erratic behavior during recording sessions. The stories were fabricated. The witnesses were friends of Danny's. The damage was permanent. Luna Rodriguez, a Latina rapper whose lyrics tackled social issues with unprecedented intelligence and fury, discovered that her demo tapes had been mysteriously lost by every major label executive I sent them to. It took me 3 months to realize that Danny had been calling these executives personally, warning them away from what he termed politically problematic artists. Thomas Wright, a country crossover artist who could have bridged the gap between Nashville and mainstream pop, found his reputation destroyed when someone leaked doctored photos suggesting he was involved with underage fans. The photos were crude fakes, but they were convincing enough to end his career before it began. Each time, I confronted Danny. Each time, he offered flimsy denials or philosophical justifications. Each time, I chose to believe him or at least to act as if I did. Each time, another artist's dreams died so that Danny Richards could remain the undisputed king of his shrinking kingdom. By 2001, other industry professionals had begun to notice. Lunch meetings became stilted affairs where potential partners spoke in careful, measured tones. Phone calls from promising artists became less frequent. Zenith Entertainment, once considered one of the most dynamic management companies in Los Angeles, was developing a reputation for instability and unreliability. I tried to compensate by working harder, staying later, making more calls, attending more showcases. I told myself that if I just proved my commitment strongly enough, if I just demonstrated my value clearly enough, Danny would stop seeing me as a threat and start seeing me as the asset I'd always been. I was chasing a ghost. The Danny who had valued my contributions, who had celebrated my successes, who had seen me as a partner rather than competition, that man had never existed. He had been a performance, a mask designed to secure my loyalty and bind me to his service. The real Danny Richards was the man who smiled at industry parties while plotting to destroy my reputation behind my back. The real Danny was the man who made love to me at night and called my business contacts the next morning to whisper poison in their ears. The real Danny was my enemy, and I had been too naive, too hopeful, too desperately in love to see it. Everything came to a head in March of 2003, at the annual Music Industry Awards ceremony in Las Vegas. I had been working for 18 months on a showcase deal that would have revolutionized how new artists were discovered and developed. Instead of the traditional model where scouts searched for talent in clubs and bars, I proposed a partnership with several major venues to host monthly showcases where unsigned artists could perform for panels of industry professionals. The concept was innovative, profitable, and desperately needed. The music industry was stagnating, recycling the same tired formulas while real talent languished in obscurity. My showcase program would have created a direct pipeline between artists and the industry, cutting through the layers of corruption and favoritism that had calcified around the traditional discovery process. I had spent months in negotiations with venue owners, label executives, and industry veterans. The contracts were complex, the logistics were challenging, and the political maneuvering required to get everyone on board was exhausting. But by March of 2003, I had succeeded. 5 major venues had signed on, 3 record labels were committed to attending every showcase, and 2 major entertainment magazines had agreed to cover the events. The showcase program was scheduled to launch in June. The announcement was planned for the awards ceremony, where I would stand before 3,000 industry professionals and unveil what I believed would be the future of music discovery. Danny knew all of this. He had been involved in the planning from the beginning, offering input on venue selections and artist criteria. He had even suggested some of the industry contacts I should approach. At the time, I thought his involvement was supportive. I realize now it was reconnaissance. The award ceremony was a typical industry spectacle: overpriced alcohol, underdressed attendees, and enough cocaine in the bathroom stalls to power a small city. I had prepared my presentation meticulously, rehearsing my speech until I could deliver it flawlessly without notes. I was scheduled to present at 9:30 p.m., during the portion of the evening dedicated to industry innovation announcements. As I waited backstage, reviewing my materials one final time, Danny appeared beside me. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I should have recognized the tone in his voice. The same satisfied gleam I'd seen in his eyes when he'd destroyed Crimson Tide. The same cold calculation that had preceded every sabotage, every betrayal, every carefully orchestrated disaster. "Thank you," I replied, focused on my speech. "I think tonight is going to change everything for us." "I think you're right," he said. At 9:25, I walked onto the stage to scattered applause. The lights were blinding, but I could make out the sea of faces in the audience, industry professionals who represented billions of dollars in potential business. This was my moment. This was when Jane Ben would step out of Danny Richards' shadow and prove that she was a force in her own right. I began my presentation confidently, outlining the problems with current talent discovery methods and explaining how my showcase program would address these issues. The audience was attentive, nodding at appropriate moments, clearly intrigued by the concept. Then I reached the portion of my speech where I was supposed to announce the participating venues and labels. I'm proud to announce that our showcase program has secured partnerships with the following industry leaders. I began, consulting my notes for the first time. That's when everything fell apart. The first venue owner I mentioned, Jerry Blackstone of the legendary Whiskey Room, stood up in the audience and shouted, "That's not true. We never agreed to any such partnership." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt my confidence waver but pressed on, assuming there had been some miscommunication. Additionally, we've secured commitments from Apex Records, Stellar Music, and bullshit. The voice belonged to Sandra Mitchell, the A&R director at Apex Records. "We pulled out of those negotiations 2 weeks ago when we learned about your history of professional instability." The murmur became a roar. I stood on the stage, exposed under the harsh lights, as one by one, the partners I thought I had secured stood up to publicly deny their involvement in my program. It wasn't just that they were backing out of the deals. They were claiming the deals had never existed in the first place. They were suggesting that I had fabricated the entire program, that I was either delusional or deliberately misleading the industry about partnerships that were figments of my imagination. The worst part wasn't the professional humiliation, though that was devastating enough. The worst part was seeing Danny in the audience, his face a mask of concerned surprise, playing the role of the supportive husband who was just as shocked as everyone else by his wife's apparent break from reality. He even stood up at one point, reaching toward the stage as if to offer comfort, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system as he called out, "Jane, honey, maybe we should." I left the stage without finishing my presentation. I walked through the backstage area, past concerned assistants and curious reporters, and straight to the hotel bar, where I ordered a double whiskey and tried to understand what had just happened. The answer came to me in pieces over the next several hours, as I made phone calls to the partners who had just destroyed me in front of the entire industry. Danny had contacted each of them personally in the weeks leading up to the awards ceremony. He had told them stories about my mental health, my reliability, my history of making promises I couldn't keep. He had shared concerns about my ability to deliver on complex projects, citing examples of past failures that I gradually realized were the very deals he had sabotaged over the years. He had used his reputation, his charm, and his connections to convince every single one of my partners that Jane Benn was not someone they wanted to do business with. And he had done it so skillfully, so convincingly, that they genuinely believed they were protecting themselves and the industry from an unstable, unreliable woman who made grandiose promises she had no intention of keeping. The showcase program died that night, along with my reputation, my credibility, and the last remnants of my belief that Danny Richards was capable of love. But something else was born that night, something I didn't recognize at first but would come to understand as the most powerful force in my life. That something was rage. Pure, focused, transformative rage. And rage, I would discover, was the most useful emotion I'd ever experienced. The weeks following the awards ceremony were the darkest of my life, but they were also the most illuminating. I spent the first 3 days in our Malibu bedroom, alternating between tears and fury, trying to process the magnitude of what Danny had done to me. The industry trades had covered the story with barely concealed glee, describing my presentation as a bizarre meltdown and a cautionary tale about the dangers of nepotism in the music business. Danny played his role perfectly. To the outside world, he was the concerned husband, worried about his wife's apparent psychological breakdown. He gave carefully worded interviews expressing his confusion about what had happened and his commitment to getting me the help I obviously needed. "Jane has been under tremendous stress lately," he told Rolling Stone. "I think the pressure of trying to prove herself in this industry may have been too much. I just want her to focus on getting healthy." The narrative was crystal clear. Jane Benn had suffered a public nervous breakdown, fabricating an elaborate fantasy about business partnerships that had never existed. Danny Richards, meanwhile, was the long-suffering husband who had tolerated his wife's delusions out of love and loyalty. On the 4th day, I stopped crying and started thinking. I had been in this industry for 16 years. I had discovered and developed dozens of successful artists. I had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I had built Zenith Entertainment from a one-room office into a major player in the Los Angeles music scene. None of that had been a delusion. None of that had been luck. I had succeeded because I understood how this industry worked, because I could identify talent before anyone else could, because I could navigate the complex web of egos and politics that determined who rose and who fell in the music business. Danny had taken advantage of that understanding, using my own expertise against me. But he had also revealed something crucial. He was afraid of me. Afraid of what I could accomplish without him. Afraid that my success might eclipse his own. You don't systematically destroy someone unless you recognize their power. On the 5th day, I drove to a bookstore in Santa Monica and bought every music industry biography, business manual, and executive memoir I could find. If Harrison Blake left Zenith Entertainment to join Apex Artist Management, it wouldn't just be a business coup, it would be a declaration of war that Danny couldn't ignore or dismiss. "Harrison," I said carefully, "you need to understand what you're proposing. This isn't just about changing management companies. This would be personal." "I know exactly what this would be," he replied. "I've seen how Danny operates. I've watched him undermine other artists, spread rumors, play politics instead of focusing on music. I don't want to be associated with that kind of business practice anymore. There will be consequences. Danny doesn't let people go easily, especially high-profile clients. Let me worry about Danny Richards. The question is, Are you interested in representing someone who could help establish Apex as a major player in this industry? I was interested. More than interested. Harrison Blake was exactly the kind of client who could transform Apex from a successful boutique management company into a legitimate threat to the established industry power structure. But I was also terrified. Taking Harrison would mean crossing a line that I could never uncross. It would mean abandoning any pretense that my war with Danny was about professional differences rather than personal vengeance. I'll need to think about it, I told Harrison. Of course. But don't think too long. I've already made my decision. The only question is whether you're ready to make yours. I spent 3 days considering Harrison's proposal, weighing the potential benefits against the certain retaliation. Danny would use every resource at his disposal to destroy both Harrison's career and mine. The industry pressure would be intense, the personal attacks would be vicious, and the professional consequences could be devastating. On the 4th day, I called Harrison back. When do you want to meet? I asked. Harrison Blake signed with Apex Artist Management on March 15, 2008, in a conference room at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The contract signing was witnessed by 2 lawyers, a notary public, and a journalist from Billboard who had been tipped off about the story. Danny's response was immediate and furious. Within hours of the story breaking, he was giving interviews to anyone who would listen, describing Harrison's decision as a betrayal orchestrated by my vindictive ex-wife and promising that certain truths about Jane Ben's business practices would soon be revealed. He followed through on that threat within the week. Suddenly, industry publications were running stories about my questionable financial arrangements with clients, my unprofessional personal relationships with artists, and my history of mental instability dating back to the awards ceremony debacle. Danny had activated every contact, called in every favor, and leveraged every relationship he had built over 3 decades in the music industry. The attacks were coordinated, vicious, and designed to destroy my credibility permanently. They might have worked if I hadn't learned from my previous defeat. This time, I was ready with a counter-narrative. Instead of defending myself against Danny's accusations, I went on the offensive, focusing attention on the pattern of his behavior toward artists and industry professionals who crossed him. I arranged for several of my former artists, the ones whose careers Danny had destroyed years earlier, to speak publicly about their experiences. Crimson Tide's former lead singer gave a devastating interview about how industry rumors had killed their momentum just when they were gaining traction. Rebecca Torres, the singer-songwriter who had disappeared from the music scene, explained how lies about her professionalism had made it impossible for her to get meetings with label executives. More importantly, I had Harrison Blake himself speaking out about why he had left Zenith Entertainment. I didn't leave because Jane Ben recruited me, Harrison told Rolling Stone. I left because I couldn't work with someone who saw other people's success as threats to his own relevance. Jane Ben represents the future of artist management. Danny Richards represents everything that's wrong with the old system. The industry was divided. Danny had more connections and more history, but I had better results and more credible witnesses. The war played out in trade publications, industry events, and whispered conversations at exclusive restaurants throughout Los Angeles. By the end of 2008, the outcome was clear. Harrison Blake's first album with Apex Artist Management had gone platinum, my roster had expanded to include several major label artists, and Apex was being mentioned in the same conversations as the most influential management companies in the business. Danny Richards, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging clients and struggling to book venues for his increasingly desperate comeback tour. The war wasn't over, but the battle lines had been drawn, and I was no longer fighting from a position of weakness. Success, I learned, was the most effective form of revenge, but it was also the most dangerous. By 2009, Apex Artist Management was representing some of the most successful musicians in the industry. Our client roster read like a who's who of contemporary music: Harrison Blake, whose albums consistently topped the charts; Sophie Chen, a pop sensation whose tour had sold out arenas across North America; The Midnight Collective, an indie rock band whose sound was being copied by major label acts, and 15 other artists whose combined album sales exceeded 30 million units. More importantly, we were changing how the industry operated. Instead of the traditional model where management companies focused primarily on profit extraction, Apex prioritized long-term artistic development and sustainable career growth. Our contracts were artist-friendly, our financial arrangements were transparent, and our approach to publicity focused on authenticity rather than manufactured controversy. The industry was taking notice. Profile pieces in major publications described me as the woman who revolutionized artist management and the executive who put musicians first. Award ceremonies included me in panels about the future of the music business. Young managers throughout Los Angeles were studying our methods and trying to replicate our success. For the first time since my marriage began, I was being recognized not as Danny Richards' wife or Danny Richards' adversary, but as Jane Benn, a formidable businesswoman in her own right. Danny's response was to escalate the war beyond anything I had imagined possible. The first sign of his new strategy came in the form of a lawsuit. Zenith Entertainment filed a claim against Apex Artist Management alleging breach of contract, tortious interference, and theft of proprietary business information. The suit demanded $10 million in damages and sought an injunction that would have prevented me from representing any artist who had previously been associated with Zenith. The allegations were baseless, but they were also brilliant. Even if Danny couldn't prove his claims in court, the existence of the lawsuit would create uncertainty about Apex's legal standing and make potential clients nervous about signing with us. I hired the best entertainment lawyers in Los Angeles and prepared for a protracted legal battle. But the lawsuit was just the opening salvo. Danny's real strategy became clear over the following months, as a coordinated campaign of sabotage began targeting every aspect of Apex's business operations. Radio stations that had been playing my artists' music suddenly developed concerns about playlist overcrowding. Venues that had booked my clients for concert dates began discovering scheduling conflicts and technical difficulties. Music journalists who had been writing positive reviews about Apex artists started focusing on other stories. The attacks were sophisticated and systematic. Danny wasn't just spreading rumors or making phone calls anymore. He was using his relationships throughout the industry to create structural obstacles that would make it increasingly difficult for Apex to operate effectively. Most insidiously, he began targeting my artists directly. Harrison Blake found himself subjected to intense scrutiny from the music press, with reporters asking increasingly personal questions about his decision to leave Zenith Entertainment. Sophie Chen discovered that her tour sponsors were reconsidering their commitments due to concerns about brand alignment. The Midnight Collective was informed that their upcoming album release might be delayed due to distribution complications. Danny was using the industry's interconnected nature against me. In the music business, everyone depends on everyone else. Labels need radio stations need advertisers need positive publicity, and artists need all of the above. By leveraging his relationship strategically, Danny could create problems for my clients without leaving fingerprints. It was a masterful campaign, and it was working. By the spring of 2010, Apex's growth had stalled. Several artists were reconsidering their contracts, and industry professionals who had been eager to work with us were suddenly harder to reach. I was facing the possibility that Danny might succeed in destroying everything I had built, not through superior business practices or better results, but through sheer institutional power and willingness to weaponize relationships. That's when I realized I had been fighting the wrong war. I had been trying to beat Danny at his own game, using his methods and operating within his system. But Danny's system was designed to protect established players like him and exclude challengers like me. No matter how talented my artists were or how successful my methods proved to be, he could always find ways to use the industry structure against me. If I wanted to win, I needed to change the game entirely. The inspiration for my ultimate strategy came from an unexpected source, a 23-year-old rapper named Devon Williams, who performed under the name D-Real. Devon had been trying to break into the music industry for 3 years, submitting demos to every label and management company in Los Angeles. His music was exceptional, politically conscious, emotionally honest, and technically sophisticated, but he couldn't get anyone to take him seriously. "The problem isn't my music," he told me during a meeting in my Silver Lake office. "The problem is that I don't fit into any of the categories these industry people understand. I'm too real for the commercial rap market and too polished for the underground scene. So what's your solution? I asked. Forget the industry. Build my own audience directly. Devon had been using social media platforms to share his music, posting videos of his performances and building a following among fans who discovered him through word of mouth rather than traditional promotional channels. His approach was completely independent of the established music industry infrastructure. I've got 50,000 followers who actually care about my music, he explained. That's more than most signed artists have. Why do I need some record executive's permission to reach people who already want to hear what I have to say? Devon's approach was revolutionary, but it was also limited. Individual artists could build independent followings, but they couldn't create the kind of systematic change that would challenge the industry's fundamental power structure. Unless, I realized, someone helped them do it collectively. That night, I began sketching out the framework for what would become the most ambitious project of my career, a comprehensive alternative to the traditional music industry infrastructure. Instead of trying to work within the existing system of record labels, radio stations, and distribution networks, I would create a parallel system that prioritized artists over executives and authentic talent over manufactured marketability. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Apex Artist Management would expand beyond individual artist representation to become a full-service alternative music industry. We would provide recording facilities, distribution networks, promotional services, and performance venues. Everything an artist needed to build a successful career without depending on the traditional industry gatekeepers. More importantly, we would do it all with complete transparency and artist-friendly business practices. No exploitative contracts, no creative control demands, no attempts to mold artists into commercially viable products. Just support for musicians who wanted to make authentic music and connect directly with audiences who appreciated that authenticity. The financial requirements were staggering. Building a comprehensive alternative infrastructure would require tens of millions of dollars in startup capital, hundreds of employees, and partnerships with technology companies, venue owners, and media platforms. But I had something that traditional industry executives lacked: a roster of successful artists who trusted me completely and were willing to invest their own resources in a system that would benefit all musicians rather than just industry shareholders. Harrison Blake was the first to commit. "I'll contribute $5 million, he said without hesitation when I explained the concept. "And I'll use my platform to promote other artists who join the network." Sophie Chen followed suit, as did the Midnight Collective and 8 other major artists on my roster. Within 6 months, I had secured over $30 million in funding from artists who wanted to be partners in building a better industry rather than just clients of another management company. We launched Meridian Media in January 2011, with recording studios in Los Angeles and Nashville, a streaming platform that competed directly with major music services, and a network of performance venues that prioritized artist development over maximum profit extraction. The response from the traditional industry was immediate and hostile. Trade publications dismissed Meridian as a vanity project and predicted that it would collapse within a year. Major labels began pressuring radio stations not to play music from Meridian artists. Concert promoters found themselves facing scheduling difficulties when they booked Meridian acts. Danny Richards was particularly vocal in his criticism, giving interviews where he described Meridian as Jane Benn's desperate attempt to remain relevant and predicted that reality will catch up with these amateur fantasies. But reality had a different perspective. Within 18 months, Meridian Media was generating over $50 million in annual revenue, representing more than 200 artists across all genres, and attracting international attention as a model for how the music industry could operate ethically and sustainably. More importantly, our success was inspiring similar initiatives throughout the entertainment industry. Independent film producers began creating alternative distribution networks. Television writers started developing streaming platforms that prioritized creative freedom over advertising revenue. Even book publishers began experimenting with author-friendly business models that challenged traditional publishing practices. Danny Richards and the old guard industry executives were no longer just fighting Jane Benn. They were fighting the future. And the future was winning. The decision to write my memoir came in 2012, during a moment of perfect clarity that arrived disguised as an anxiety attack. I was sitting in my office at Meridian Media's Los Angeles headquarters, reviewing quarterly reports that showed we had exceeded every financial projection and growth target we had established. Our streaming platform had 5 million active users, our recording studios were booked solid for the next 18 months, and our artist roster included some of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful musicians in the world. By every objective measure, I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish. I had built an alternative to the traditional music industry. I had proven that ethical business practices could be more profitable than exploitative ones. I had demonstrated that Jane Benn was not only independent of Danny Richards but was, in fact, a more successful and influential figure in the music industry than he had ever been. So why, I wondered as my heart raced and my hands trembled, did I still feel like I was fighting a war that would never end? The answer came to me gradually, over the following weeks, as I found myself obsessively reading industry coverage of Meridian's success. The articles were overwhelmingly positive, but they all shared a common narrative framework. They described my achievements in the context of my relationship with Danny Richards. Jane Benn's Revenge, read one headline. From rock wife to industry revolutionary, declared another. Even the most respectful profiles couldn't resist framing my success as a response to Danny's betrayals rather than as an independent accomplishment. I realized that as long as the public narrative about my career remained focused on my marriage and divorce, Danny would continue to define me. He would always be the protagonist of my story, the force that had shaped my development and motivated my decisions. That had to change. And I knew exactly how to change it. The Sound of Betrayal. My life in the music industry took me 14 months to write. It was not a simple memoir or a celebrity tell-all. It was a comprehensive analysis of how the music industry operated, told through the lens of my personal experiences with corruption, manipulation, and systematic abuse of power. I was methodical in my approach. Every anecdote was supported by documentation. Every accusation was backed up by evidence. Every claim about industry practices was verified by multiple sources. The book detailed Danny's sabotage campaigns, but it placed them within the larger context of how the music industry had always operated. Danny wasn't an aberration, he was a typical example of how established players used personal relationships and industry connections to maintain their power and suppress potential competition. More importantly, I used the book to tell the stories of all the artists whose careers had been destroyed by industry politics. Crimson Tide, Rebecca Torres, Victor Kendall, Luna Rodriguez, Thomas Wright. Musicians whose names had been forgotten but whose experiences illustrated the human cost of the industry's corrupted practices. The book also served as a comprehensive guide to how the music industry could be reformed. I detailed Meridian Media's business model, explained our financial structures, and provided a roadmap that other entrepreneurs could follow to create similar alternative systems. I wasn't just telling my story. I was providing a blueprint for systemic change. The manuscript was completed in September 2013. I showed it to exactly 3 people before submitting it to publishers: my lawyer, my publicist, and Harrison Blake. "This is going to destroy him," Harrison said after reading the section about Danny's sabotage campaigns. "No," I corrected. "This is going to reveal who he's always been. There's a difference." The book was published by Simon & Schuster in March 2014, with an initial print run of 100,000 copies and a coordinated media campaign that included interviews with major newspapers, appearances on television talk shows, and features in music industry publications. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Sound of Betrayal debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list and remained in the top 10 for 16 weeks. More importantly, it sparked an industry-wide conversation about business ethics, artist rights, and the need for structural reform in the music business. Danny's response was predictably furious and ultimately self-destructive. Instead of ignoring the book or dismissing it as fiction, he chose to engage in a very public defense of his reputation. He gave dozens of interviews challenging specific claims in the memoir, threatened lawsuits that he never filed, and made increasingly desperate attempts to discredit me personally. His defensive campaign only served to draw more attention to the book's allegations and to confirm many of the patterns of behavior I had documented. Industry professionals who had witnessed Danny's actions over the years began sharing their own stories, and a picture emerged of systematic misconduct that extended far beyond his relationship with me. Within 6 months of the book's publication, Danny Richards was persona non grata in the music industry he had dominated for 3 decades. Former allies distanced themselves from him, venues cancelled his concert dates, and the few artists still represented by Zenith Entertainment began seeking new management. But the book's impact extended far beyond Danny's personal downfall. The Sound of Betrayal became required reading for music industry professionals, journalism students, and business ethics courses at major universities. It was translated into 12 languages and sparked similar reform movements in entertainment industries throughout the world. Most importantly, it definitively changed the narrative about my career. I was no longer Danny Richards' ex-wife who built a successful business. I was Jane Benn, the woman who had exposed corruption in the music industry and created a viable alternative to exploitative business practices. The war was over, and I had won by refusing to fight on Danny's terms. 5 years after the publication of The Sound of Betrayal, I found myself standing on the stage of the same Las Vegas Convention Center where I had been humiliated in 2003. This time, I was there to receive the Music Industry Professional of the Year award from the International Music Business Association. The audience included 3,000 industry professionals, many of whom had witnessed my public breakdown 11 years earlier. My acceptance speech was brief and focused on the future rather than the past. When I started Meridian Media, I told the audience, people said I was trying to destroy the music industry. They were wrong. I was trying to save it. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. By 2019, Meridian Media had evolved far beyond my original vision. We operated recording studios in 12 cities, managed a streaming platform with over 50 million users, and represented more than 800 artists across all genres and career stages. Our business model had been copied by dozens of other companies, creating a parallel music industry infrastructure that prioritized artist development over profit extraction. The traditional record labels that had once dominated the business were struggling to compete with more ethical alternatives that offered better contracts and more creative freedom. More importantly, we had proven that treating artists as partners rather than products was not just morally superior but financially more successful. Meridian's annual revenues exceeded $500 million, and our profit margins consistently outperformed those of traditional industry companies. The artists we represented weren't just successful, they were revolutionizing popular music. Harrison Blake had become one of the most influential singer-songwriters of his generation. Sophie Chen's tours were cultural events that redefined what pop music could accomplish. The Midnight Collective had inspired an entire movement of indie rock bands who prioritized artistic integrity over commercial appeal. Even Devon Williams, the young rapper whose independent approach had inspired my original alternative industry concept, had become a major figure in contemporary hip-hop while maintaining complete creative control over his music. Our success had attracted the attention of investors from throughout the entertainment industry, but I had consistently refused offers to sell or merge with larger companies. Meridian Media would remain independent, artist-owned, and committed to the principles that had guided its development from the beginning. Danny Richards, meanwhile, had disappeared from the music industry entirely. His last album had been released in 2015 to universally negative reviews and minimal sales. Zenith Entertainment had closed its doors in 2017, and Danny himself had retreated to a house in Arizona where he apparently spent his time writing angry blog posts that no one read. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. Danny's destruction had never been my goal. His irrelevance was simply a natural consequence of his refusal to adapt to an industry that no longer tolerated the kind of behavior he had built his career on. The real satisfaction came from the artists. Every successful album release, every sold-out concert tour, every creative breakthrough achieved by a musician who had been given the freedom to develop their authentic voice, those were the victories that mattered. I had built something that would outlast both Danny's legacy and my own. Meridian Media wasn't just a business. It was a demonstration that the entertainment industry could operate ethically while remaining commercially successful. I am writing these final words in my office at Meridian Media's Nashville headquarters, looking out at a recording studio where a 22-year-old country singer is working on her debut album. Her name is Emma Rodriguez, and 6 months ago she was performing in coffee shops for tips, just like Alex Connor was when I first discovered him 16 years ago. Her voice has the same haunting quality that made me believe in music's power to change lives, and her songs have the kind of authentic emotional honesty that cuts through all the manufactured noise of contemporary pop culture. Emma doesn't know that she's part of a legacy that began with my humiliation and Danny's betrayal. She doesn't need to know. All she needs to know is that Meridian Media will support her artistic development without trying to control her creative voice, and that her success will be measured by the quality of her music rather than the size of her bank account. That's what victory looks like, a young artist who has opportunities one never had, working within a system that prioritizes creativity over exploitation. Danny Richards taught me many things during our marriage, though none of them were lessons he intended to impart. He taught me that love without respect is indistinguishable from hatred. He taught me that talent without integrity is ultimately worthless. He taught me that power without purpose corrupts everything it touches. Most importantly, he taught me that the best revenge is not the destruction of your enemies but the creation of something so beautiful and successful that their attacks become irrelevant. I built an empire from the ashes of my marriage, and that empire has become something larger than personal vindication. Meridian Media has changed how the music industry operates, demonstrated that ethical business practices are more profitable than exploitative ones, and created opportunities for thousands of artists who might otherwise have been ignored or mistreated by traditional industry gatekeepers. The fire that Danny tried to extinguish when he sabotaged my first business deals has become a torch that lights the way for an entire generation of musicians and industry professionals. That fire will burn long after both of us are forgotten, carried forward by artists like Emma Rodriguez who have been given the freedom to create authentic music and connect directly with audiences who value honesty over artifice. The war is over. The dynasty has been built. The future belongs to the artists. And sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing contracts or listening to demo recordings from musicians who still perform in coffee shops and dream of changing the world with their songs, I remember that scared, angry woman who walked off a Las Vegas stage 11 years ago and decided to stop fighting other people's battles and start building her own kingdom. She had no idea what she was capable of. She had no idea that betrayal could be transformed into purpose, that humiliation could become motivation, that the very system designed to destroy her could be rebuilt in her image. She had no idea that Jane Ben would become a name that young artists spoke with reverence, that industry executives studied with respect, and that music history would remember as the woman who proved that the business of music could be both profitable and ethical. She had no idea that the rock star's reckoning would become the music industry's revolution. But fire, I have learned, always knows exactly what it's burning toward.